Let's begin with our top story now, coming out of Germany, where world leaders at a summit in Berlin have endorsed a UN arms embargo on Libya. The different sides agreed to end the role of foreign powers in the country's war as part of a wider plan to end the conflict. This report now has the details.
With over 100,000 people killed and 1 million displaced, the world has finally turned its attention to the conflict in Libya. Rival camps and their foreign backers met in Berlin for a summit to find a way to end the long-running war. Gathered together by Germany, presidents of Russia, Turkey and France, among others, signed a plan to stop interference in Tripoli's affairs.
We have to make sure that all the parties involved in the Libya conflict speak with one voice. And that was the goal of today's conference. Because then also the parties inside Libya will understand that there is only one non-military way to a solution. And we have achieved this goal.
Libya's UN-recognized Prime Minister, Fayez al-Sarraj, and the commander of the Eastern Forces, Khalifa Haftar, also appeared at the gathering. However, they refused to meet each other, but did agree to set up a military commission, a step towards a lasting ceasefire. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, stressed a widespread support for the ceasefire.
We need to have a ceasefire. We have a truce. And one central question is that all the participants today committed to support the ceasefire and committed to put pressure on the parties to the conflict for a full ceasefire to be reached.
Speaking at the conference, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he hoped Libya's major oil fields will now be reopened. Khalifa Haftar's military closed eastern Libya's oil ports before the Berlin summit.
Well, to discuss that further, we're now joined by Joel Shalit, who is a journalist based in Berlin. Joel, as always, we appreciate your time here at Indus News. Now, Joel, at the Berlin summit for Libya, world countries endorsed a UN arms embargo. How important is that then to establish peace there?
It's a nice gesture, but I don't think it's going to have any practical consequence given the diverse number of suppliers that help fuel the conflict. Also, one must remember that the Libyan civil war, which is now nearly a decade old, has been heavily fueled by domestic arms supplies that were accrued during the Gaddafi period. Libya has had one of the richest stockpiles of military weapons in North Africa and in the greater Middle East. It's not unlike Syria in that regard. So it's a cosmetic gesture. It's more than anything else. And the main problem is going to be finding a way to halt the third parties involved in the conflict outside of Haftar and Sarraj's forces acquiring weapons on their own, regionally. One must remember that nearly a third of the country is still controlled by various militias under neither faction's control.
Let's also talk about, Joel, the external players involved in Libya. They've all now agreed to walk away, essentially. What are the chances of these sorts of external players keeping the agreement they've just signed?
The two primary foreign players in the conflict are Turkey and Russia. And Turkey already has troops on the ground. They've brought both their own troops and elements of their own, Syrian Foreign Legion to help defend the incumbent UN-recognized government. We didn't hear anything about Turkey withdrawing those forces as part of those agreements, and we should keep our eyes out for any announcements of Turkey withdrawing those troops. Similarly, the Russians have a history of putting down mercenaries such as the Wagner Group in trouble spots like Syria and not taking responsibility for them, saying they're private contractors when in fact they are an arm of the Russian military and they are executing Russian foreign policy. So jury is still out as far as Turkey and Russia are concerned. I think it's very important, again, vis-a-vis Syria, that we look at many of the same dynamics being at play in Libya as we do in Syria, with many of these same actors behaving exactly the same way.
And just finally, Fayez al-Sarraj and Khalifa Haftar, Joel, as you know, have refused to meet each other. To what extent does this create an obstacle in the way of peace?
I don't think that going to be any national reconciliation between the two parties. I think that simply reflects the fact that Libya is divided largely between two warring factions, one of which has more territory than the other. Haftar and his troops occupy 2/3 of the country and by default run the country. I have a hard time understanding why the European Union and the West is so focused on guaranteeing the continuity of the Sarraj government.
Very well, we'll leave there at that, Joel. But of course, as always, we appreciate your insight here at Indus News. Let's move on now. Russia has said its air defense systems have repelled a drone attack on its base at Hmeimim in Syria's Latakia governorate. Russia's defense ministry says no one was hurt and no damage was reported. The ministry said defense systems spotted 3 small aerial targets approaching the military facility. It said anti-missile systems destroyed the targets at a safe distance from the base. Syrian state media said the drones were launched from the de-escalation zone in the north. Well, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and French President Emmanuel Macron have restated their commitment to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. This comes after Johnson had called for the deal to be scrapped and replaced with a new one. The leaders of both countries have agreed to a long-term framework during their meeting on the sidelines of the Libya summit in Berlin. A Downing Street spokesperson said they agreed on the importance of de-escalation and finding a diplomatic way through the current tensions. The leader's statement follows the deal's European signatories triggering a diplomatic dispute mechanism last week. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has described Europe's signatories as no longer trustworthy. Well, Canada is pushing Iran to hand over black box recorders from the Ukrainian passenger plane shot down in Tehran 2 weeks ago. Foreign Minister François-Philippe Champagne says the recorders should be passed to France or Ukraine to be analyzed. The Canadian Foreign Minister spoke to his Iranian counterpart, Javad Zarif. He said Ottawa wants Tehran to send the black boxes as soon as possible so the analysis can be done in a transparent fashion. Earlier, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau urged Iran to send the data recorders to France. He said the country is one of few which can decode the plane's data. Elsewhere in Indian-occupied Kashmir, Indian forces have martyred 3 more civilians in Shopian district. Witnesses said occupation forces used heavy weaponry and explosives during a cordon and search operation in the Wachalatar area. Kashmiri media said Indian troops' operation began earlier this morning. Occupation forces have martyred 10 Kashmiris during the current month so far. The occupied valley is reeling under a crushing curfew and communications blackout by India for the past 169 days. In India itself, 70,000 people have come out onto the streets against the controversial Citizenship Act in the eastern state of Jharkhand. Organizers said protesters included 30,000 women in Jharkhand's capital, Ranchi. Speaking to media, organizers said this was the biggest protest of the state against the new act. Protesters said the government will have to withdraw the act because it is against one religion, and humanity. Meanwhile, hundreds held a rally from Jama Masjid to Shaheen Bagh in India's capital, New Delhi. Protesters paraded a mocked detention camp during the march while chanting slogans of independence. In a related development, Sumitra Khan, a leading member of India's ruling party, has called people and celebrities opposed to the controversial Citizenship Act dogs. Indian activists, students, politicians, and even actors have been protesting across the country against the anti-Muslim law for over a month. In a rally, the Bharatiya Janata Party leader said people who oppose the law are dogs of West Bengal's Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee. Another BJP leader, Keshav Prasad Maurya, has called protesters opposing the act mentally affected. The ruling party leader said such people need medical treatment. 27 people have died in nationwide protests since the act was passed in December. In Bangladesh, a court has sentenced 10 members of the banned militant group Harkatul Jihad al-Islami to death. They have been convicted for the 2001 bombings in the capital Dhaka that killed 8 people and wounded over 50 others. During the verdict, 4 of the 13 were present in the court. 4 of the 13 accused, I should say, were present in the court, while 6 were tried in absentia. In its final decision, the Dhaka Metropolitan Session Special Tribunal acquitted 2 of the accused. The plot ringleader and Harkatul Jihad al-Islami chief Mufti Abdul Hannan was hanged in 2017 for his involvement in a separate grenade attack. I'll be back after this break with plenty more news. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, over 1,000 banks, asset managers, payment companies and insurers in the EU have planned to open offices in post-Brexit Britain. UK clients regulatory consultancy Boval says the financial firms intend to continue serving clients in Britain. Boval said new offices and staff will help mitigate business losses as the current two-way direct access between Britain and the European Union ends in December. As a first step, the organizations have applied for temporary permission to operate in the country. Boval said firms who until now have been able to serve UK customers come from France, Cyprus and Germany. The extent of access to each other's markets after December is subject to negotiations between the EU and Britain. Let's move on now to Paraguay, where 75 inmates have escaped from a prison in the northeast of the country by digging a tunnel. Officials say cells in the prison were found to contain some 200 bags of soil excavated from the tunnel. The Interior Ministry says the escape occurred in Amambe, which borders Brazil. The ministry says many of the escapees were members of one of Brazil's largest criminal organizations responsible for trafficking arms and drugs. Officials have launched an investigation but suspect the prisoners may have crossed the border. The exiled ex-Bolivian President Evo Morales has named his party's candidate in upcoming elections for president and vice president. Speaking at a conference in Argentina, Morales said the former economy minister, Luis Arce Atacora, will run for president. Morales named the ex-foreign minister, David Choquehuanca, as Catacora's running mate in the May 3rd election. Morales announced the candidates after meeting with senior MAS party officials in the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires. In a recent opinion poll, 20% of voters chose an MAS candidate. 15% went for the interim president, Jeanine Áñez, as their preferred winner. Well, in Hong Kong, police have arrested a prominent pro-democracy activist a day after protests turned violent. Yesterday, violence broke out after thousands of demonstrators attempted to march through the city in defiance of a ban. In a statement, the Hong Kong Civil Assembly team said Ventus Lau was arrested on charges of obstruction of police administration. Earlier, authorities allowed protesters to demonstrate as long as participants stayed in one location. However, the protest moved in defiance of prior warnings, prompting riot police to fire tear gas and arrest several people. The protest began in June last year against a bill allowing extradition to mainland China. The bill was withdrawn 3 months later, but demonstrations continue and now demand complete democracy. After killing 3 people and infecting 139 others in China, the mysterious and fatal new coronavirus is spreading to Southeast Asia. Japan, South Korea and Thailand have confirmed cases, while Singapore has suspected patients.
South Korea has just reported its first confirmed case of coronavirus. Last week, 1 was confirmed in Japan and 2 more in Thailand. Each victim had recently traveled to Wuhan. Singapore has also reported 5 suspected cases of the virus. Airports in the region, as well as 3 in the US, have beefed up their health screening as a result of the outbreak. Coronaviruses usually cause mild to moderate upper respiratory tract illnesses, such as the common cold. These viruses can also affect the lower respiratory tract, causing fatal pneumonia or bronchitis. Medical experts are still struggling to understand the new strain of coronavirus.
7 people have died on the Indonesian island of Sumatra when a footbridge packed with people snapped. Police say some victims fell into the overflowing river below and drowned, while 3 more are still missing and are feared dead. Rescue officials say 30 people, mostly students, had just returned from a tour and stopped on the bridge to take photos. Officials said 20 survivors have been rescued, many with minor injuries. They said the river level below the bridge was higher than usual after torrential rains pounded the region. Well, 200 people trapped under tons of snow by an avalanche in Nepal's Annapurna region have been rescued. Officials say the rescued people, who included tourists, guides, and helpers, have now been taken to safety. Authorities say 7 missing trekkers have still not been found because of the harsh weather. Police say the trekkers include 4 South Koreans and 3 local guides. A tourism official says heavy layers of snow have covered the region, hindering the search and rescue operation. Well, 3 people have been killed after a fire erupted on a pipeline owned by Nigeria's state oil company in the commercial capital, Lagos. Residents say the fire also burned nearby houses and vehicles. Many fires on pipelines in Nigeria are caused by theft and sabotage. The Director General of the State Emergency Management Agency said his team has found that some undesirable elements vandalized the pipeline. Officials say the state oil company is assessing the situation. 3 men have been stabbed to death in Ilford, East London. Police say all 3 victims were pronounced dead on the scene. Authorities say no arrests have yet been made, while they are still formally identifying the victims. They say the case could be a triple murder investigation. London Mayor Sadiq Khan condemned the killings, expressing his grief for the families and local community. Local media say UK knife crimes have risen by 80% over the last 5 years. That includes 40,000 cases in the last 12 months. On to the U.S. now, where 2 police officers have been shot dead in Honolulu on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Authorities say the incident happened in a residential district near Diamond Head, a popular tourist destination. The man who fatally shot the officers then barricaded himself inside a house after setting it on fire. Officials believe he has now died. Police said they closed the street in Diamond Head near Waikiki Beach and are investigating. A recent study has found 1% of the world's richest population holds twice as much wealth as the bottom 90%. In a report, the global charity Oxfam says the gap between rich and the rest of humanity has reached grotesque proportions. The new report, Time to Care, shows the world's top 20 richest men now have more wealth than all women in Africa. The report says there are only 2,153 billionaires in the world, but their wealth matches that of 4.5 billion people. The report said India's richest 1% hold more than 4 times the wealth of the bottom 70% of that country's people. Also in the U.S., the 26th Screen Actors Guild Awards have been presented in Los Angeles. The night's big winners are not so different from the 2020 Golden Globe Awards. In business news, stock markets across Europe are trading lower as policymakers and business leaders gather in Davos for the annual World Economic Forum. Investors are treading cautiously amid a lack of positive triggers. The CAC 40 in Paris has lost a fraction as leisure and utility stocks fall. Frankfurt's DAX and London's FTSE 100 are also trading marginally lower. In Asia, Hong Kong's Hang Seng lost nearly 1% as shares of life insurer AIA dropped over 1%. Seoul's Kospi and Shanghai Composite closed over 0.5% higher amid a fresh rally in the stocks. Meanwhile, international oil prices have surged about 1% after oil pipeline shutdown in Libya has crippled supplies there. Storms have brought heavy rains to the fire-hit regions of eastern Australia, but authorities there say the bushfire crisis is still far from over. More severe storms have also been forecast for the fire-ravaged states in the next few days. More than 80 blazes still burn across New South Wales and Victoria states despite the downpours. Melbourne and Canberra have been hit by heavy hailstorms, with hail as big as golf balls witnessed in some areas. In the meantime, a huge dust storm has swept across towns in the central west of the New South Wales. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. And with that, you're all caught up. Thank you for watching this bulletin here on Indus News.